Welcome back to session 2, and in this particular session we want to start on the first set of activities for a senior executive, and that is setting strategy. And how do we set strategy when the world is moving so quickly? How do we do that when things are so uncertain?
Of course it's a challenge, and it does require us to get an understanding of the neurology or the way the mind functions. We know that our brains are coded to use the past to predict the future. Søren Kierkegaard, who's a Dutch philosopher from the 19th century, father of existentialism, he says that life can only be understood backwards, but we must live it forwards. And there's a much deeper implication in that. It's a brilliant quote, but the deeper implication is that if we live in this positive view of the future, or we live in this striving to be great and wonderful in the future, what we do is we spend too little time figuring out what actually just happened to us. On the other hand, if we spend too much time ruminating in the past and worrying about the past, we get very little time to make a prediction in the future. What happens in complexity is we shorten the loop. We have to take quicker, smaller and more careful look at what's just happened, and then project that into the future. Yogi Berra, the famous American baseball player, said the future ain't what it used to be. And it's a very profound idea, because in stability, the future looked a lot like the past, plus the little invention we did. And now the future's almost designing itself without much of our intervention. And I think it's that idea that makes us need to shorten the iterations of our prediction, shorten the iterations of our sense-making, so that we can bring the amount of data we're working with into a smaller amount of data, small sense, small prediction, and do those more often.
Well, I think, Errol, we're certainly living, and we can feel that the future ain't what it used to be. But I just want to sort of tap into neurologically, like, you know, we have this need for certainty, right? We need to make these patterns. And in fact, part of our series here is really how do we connect the dots? What's the landscape? And how do we start to see the wood from the trees? So pattern recognition, all those things. They're all really important concepts for strategy development. In the past, you know, they weren't really included in strategy development. What are the takeaways today? What are the things from a neurobiology level that we should be aware of in terms of strategy, and how we incorporate that into perhaps traditional strategy development or something else?
If the future ain't what it used to be, and the past is no longer the best predictor of performance, the question we ask ourselves then, what is? And the closest thing to the future is what? It's the present. Exactly. When we use mindfulness, we must be careful that we're not using it in the meditation term. So in the meditation term, mindfulness is a sort of meditation where you let a thought come in and let it go through to the keeper, so to speak. That's not what we're doing. Mindfulness...
Although that is being talked a lot. Right now we see a lot of people who are saying that.
Excellent. But that's when you're wanting to calm down and not think. So there's kind of a paradox here, where mindfulness can be when you want to calm down and think, and mindfulness is when you want to do slow thinking, which is Daniel Kahneman's idea. So I think it's important to understand that slow thinking in Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking is what we're talking about. It's meticulous thinking, it's careful thinking, it's looking for the signals, it's looking in for patterns. The human brain can do really good rational thinking, but the programming that we've done for a century is not that natural. We see the literal process of strategic thinking, or the literal process of prediction, is a pattern that's recognized. It generates a slightly different pattern with an intentional shift to it, and then it matches that to reality. And of course in VUCA, it's very difficult to generate a pattern that matches reality, and then the loop comes back and causes us uncertainty. So this pattern understanding explains the uncertainty, explains the challenge of making predictions in uncertainty. So it's actually almost a structural way of looking, and it's uncertain.
I mean, it's a really, really good point, Errol, because I sort of look across the MBA curriculum. I don't see anyone really talking about, the psychology of strategy. I think what you're saying is this is something we've got to master. We've got to understand how our sort of brains work. We've got to understand this concept, particularly today, around making sense.
We need to build an experimental mindset. Now, an experimental mindset is different to an empirical mindset. An empirical mindset is, I know everything now, I'll do a tweak, and then I'll know everything later. And whereas an experimental mindset says, I'm going to do a small tweak, I don't know whether it's going to work, I'm going to test whether it's going to work, and then I'll find the ones that do work. And that plays into the idea of intuition, which we haven't talked about yet. And intuition is this thing we all know it's there. The thinking leaders, people who think well, are very familiar with the fact that intuition is a pattern and that it is vague. And vagueness is the thing that gives it its power because it's agile. Fixed, if I totally believe my pattern is perfect, I don't want to change it. But if I believe I kind of made it up with some gut feel, it'll alter quite quickly when I get more data.
Okay, so, and I mean, that's a concept that we've been talking about for quite some time in the business world around organisational agility, but it always starts with the individual, this personal agility. So I think we're saying with the landscapes moving so quickly and so much change, that we've got to start honing our skills around intuition. We've got to start understanding around how we think. There's lots of commentary today about biases, but it's certainly more than that, right? All the biases that Kahneman and others have introduced. I think today the executive really has to be a learner more than any time, and particularly around this area of critical thinking. This is probably something more important than at any time in the past. When the landscape is moving so quickly, how do you get as much information, and then how do you make sense out of that information?
You'll hear many people say, well, I'm not very good at math, or I'm not very good at languages. You will hear very few people say, I'm not very good at critical thinking. And it's because we don't really have an understanding of what critical thinking is. It isn't excellent thinking. It isn't analytical thinking.
Right. Okay. Certainly many would believe that, right? So what is it?
Exactly. It's thinking about thinking. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important things for leaders today, is that if we know we need organizations to think better, so the people in organizations need to think better. So if I'm a leader and I have to know more than the followers, and they need to think more, then I need to be able to think even better. And critical thinking is thinking about thinking, is the capacity to deconstruct and then to reconstruct the way an idea has been put together, and to look at the evidence behind that idea and to be able to check that that evidence has some real evidence or it isn't made up.
So this is a skill that can be learnt.
Yes.
It's certainly one that I'm not aware of that we talk about in our business schools and in terms of executive programs, MBAs and others. So you're saying it's something we've got to develop. It's something that's learnable, critical thinking, and it helps us to become better learners, and it helps us to make better informed and better decisions in the workplace.
Well, good analytical thinking is critical, isn't it? It's critical of what you're looking at. So I'm analyzing something, I'm critical of it, I'm looking for cause, and that's critical. Well, it's not a difficult concept to move the topic of what you're being critical about to thinking itself. So it's moving the idea from the thing you're analyzing to the thought that you're analyzing.
Okay.
So it's not a change in ideas, it's what you're looking at and what you're analyzing. And it isn't talked about.
No, it certainly isn't talked about. One of the things that is talked about and is certainly mainstay in this field is this concept of profiling. We have these assessments, we have 360 assessments and many other tools that sort of are very descriptive and sort of put us into maybe one of 4 boxes or other and say, well, this is what you're like. But today, when the environment's so loose and there's so much change, you want to move away from description possibly and towards more profiling type tools and ways of operating.
I think that's a shift that has to come with VUCA, that has to come with experimental thinking. And the shift is what we call descriptive models and predictive models. Now, what do we mean by that? I think one of the most famous descriptive models, which everybody knows, is Myers-Briggs.
Now tell me, Myers-Briggs.
And when it first showed up in the 80s in my corporate career, you were told which of the 16 groups you were in, and ENTJ, I was there, which is the right group for a CEO. You're supposed to be very bossy. Everybody celebrated their groups. You went to a workshop and then it was like, whoa, I'm this one and I'm that one. And Myers-Briggs have worked really hard to attempt to make that more agile.
Right.
But it still is a descriptor. So what descriptor models do is they try and describe the whole world. So it's got to be at least more than 8 or 10 categories. That's 12 LSIs. That's 16, 12 LSIs, 12. And somebody fits somewhere in the category and you get yourself, guess what? A label. And once you've got a label, you kind of know who I am, and you know who she is, and you know how to deal with that person's label.
And you can manage it. You can work with it.
Well,
You've got a label.
Control it.
You can control it.
Absolutely, the whole issue of control.
But in uncertainty, that's not really the case, right? There's just this illusion of control. So we want to move away from descriptive models towards
predictor models. So what a predictor model is, it will likely have less than 7 or 8 categories. Number one, each category isn't definitive. Number two, somebody will fit into more than one category. Now, listen to what I've just said. The categories aren't defined and you're in more than one category. That'll do someone's head in. That's really hard to wrap your head around.
That's different thinking.
It is different thinking. The idea of that is that we then can allow for a changing context. Because if somebody's in 2 or 3 categories, we can match the characteristic that they show in that context to the characteristic in that context and that context. So what we now have is a richer view of the person. We don't have one label. We have vague sort of views of 3 different behaviors in 3 different contexts, which we all know we do. We don't have to use reductionism to get them into one box. We allow them to be that more variable human. And then we now have 3 pieces of data because we've got 3 categories, and we can then match 3 pieces of data to the future better. Because if you've got one category, taking that person into the future from a prediction point of view is almost impossible because you don't know what's going to change. If you can see the movement, if you can see the variation in categories of a predictor model, you can then profile. And profiling in the VUCA must replace analysis, must replace assessment tools.
Okay.
Because assessment tools use reductionism to get us into exactly the right place for control. Worked perfectly 30 years ago. It was great. Don't knock it. And now we can't get people into that certainty. Leaders need to be able to work with people in a way that they can profile in a general view and make better predictions and make better guidance, be able to lead them better because you can see part of the next step.
Errol, that's a big shift though. In fact, you're sort of moving us into this quantum world where you can be in 2 places at once, and it's a quantum shift, I'd say. And not all leaders can make those shifts. I guess what we're saying so far is that, in times of change, we've got to really think differently. We've got to be learners, but not everyone is able to do that, Can you tell us a little bit more about this sort of adult development scales?
Adult development scales are the progression from adult thinking from very, very fixed thinking towards a more agile strategic thinking. So it's interesting that we do have a grading capacity to measure, predict and profile this capability of people to think differently. And there are a number of them. And I think it's the psychology of the leader who becomes, at that very pivotal moment, the psychology of the leader becomes disillusioned with certainty. Now, nobody wants the amount of uncertainty we have now, but they've become disillusioned with that comfort. Because they have the comfort, then the world sends them an error. They have the comfort, the world, eventually they go, I need something more. And that's your leader who is predisposed to be able to grasp these ideas. Because they're already past the stage of desiring certainty. They know it just lets them down, and they're going, I want more.
Errol, and let me just ask on that. I mean, at the moment, I'm dealing with a lot of senior executives who are now saying, look, it's possibly time for me to exit the workforce. I think it's all getting a bit too much. And so is this a skill that can be learnt? Is this a set of capabilities that people can learn, or is it innate?
It all depends on if the person's wanting to leave the workforce because they're overwhelmed, okay, and maybe they're in the mindset where they go, I've always thoroughly enjoyed doing things perfectly right, being confident, and I don't like this feeling, and I have choices. And that's good, retire, It's when the leader says, I'm looking for something else. He looks around and he's saying, I want something else. I know I'm struggling. I don't want to leave the workforce. I'm kind of enjoying this. I actually like the thrill of a little bit of cut and thrust, or the thrill of this, but I really do need to, I want to find something I can use to improve this. It's that optimism of staying. But I just feel that I'm missing something. And I was like that. I had my career in South Africa, CEO roles, and I knew there was something I wasn't being told about people. I just knew it. I knew there was more to it. And I knew the business schools had all the answers when the answers were certain, but they had very few answers when the answers were uncertain.
Right.
And I was like, where is this? And I did a master's in applied psych at Sydney University, and I found in the humanities that all the knowledge that I'd used as intuition had been researched, written about, and by hundreds of people. I mean, we know in the world a huge amount of knowledge about people.
All right, so Errol, I guess the question is this something that's learnable? Is it something that's teachable and learnable? And if so, how might you do that?
There's a silly joke, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer's only one, but the light bulb needs to want to change. And I think this is very much around whether the leader's self-belief, we go back to Edgar Schein, is how much risk aversion are they? And lots of leaders are not risk averse, and we sometimes call them in a humorous way anxious high performers. In other words, these people are really talented, and they worry they're not good enough. We get our more alpha people who worry they're not big enough, and they want to be bigger and not wrong, whereas anxious high performers worry they're not good enough, and they know they have a talent. And that's your kind of sweet spot for leaders and executives who really want to, because they have that burning desire to develop and grow. They need something to grow with.
And particularly relevant when the landscape's really shifting, right? Because you can't be too certain.
Well, you've got to get used to being certain. That's how they kind of, so that stage between developing from a conventional adult development into a post-conventional, into that agility, that capacity to work with uncertainty, the capacity to be comfortable, that's the shift where the conventional thinker isn't giving up on being certain and wanting to go home. They're actually saying, I want to work with this, and it's exciting, and I get a thrill from it, but I need something to make sense. And I think that's how to identify them. So anxious high performers are probably your group of leaders who are the most good to spend money on. Now, if we go back as to how we actually do that, We do that through adult cognitive development, which is cognitive psychology of how the brain does learn. And adults don't learn by accumulating knowledge like children do. Adults learn by having to undo something, having to have an idea that is disruptive, is challenged, and then to acquire a new one. And the interesting part of that is when they acquire the next idea, they also remember the old idea. And so they can then have this backwards perspective of an idea or a thought they had. They can see the change in the one they've just acquired, which is different, which is more useful. And that longitudinal backwards and forwards understanding of development is the key to learnability, people who are able to learn. They get a look backwards as to what they did know that didn't work, a look now as to what they now do know that does work. They had to go through a disruption from letting go of the one to acquiring the second, and that longitudinal idea gives them that self-belief, which we can now see reduces their risk of learning.
Okay, and
that
makes
reduces
sense.
their perception of risk of learning. They don't see it they see it something that they can do, as opposed to something they can't do. And that's the biggest switch. And organizations need to be able to profile and find these people and develop them, because we're needing to develop good thinkers. And certainly, lots of people will get there, but it's about the low-hanging fruit, or the people learning ready is what we call it.
Terrific. Okay, so I think that's a critical point. Organisations need to be able to find, profile, and then develop these folk. So Errol, as we sort of, just to wrap up, we started by saying in this world of uncertainty and consistent, continual change, it's very, very hard to do strategy, traditional strategy. So we've got to supplement that with small experiments and shift along the way, but we've also got to start thinking differently about strategy and understanding how we think and our need for pattern recognition, our biases, things that get in the way. And that really means that we've got to hone our critical thinking skills, and that the executive has to be a learner, and that's one of the things ultimately organisations should be doing, really, finding those, profiling them, and then developing them even further.